Hi, welcome to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm your host, Mark Grabe, and our guest today is John Willis. He's an accomplished IT management expert with over 45 years of experience. His extensive body of work includes his book, Deming's Journey to Profound Knowledge, and he co-authored the book, The DevOps Handbook. He also hosts, there's no co involved, he hosts a podcast that I was recently on called Profound. There's that phrase from Dr. Deming, profound knowledge. And we had a great conversation there. We get to turn the tables and continue the conversation. So before I tell you more about John, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Oh, great, Mark. Thank you. Like I think I told you in our other podcast that, when I first went seeking for Deming, some of your blogs were the first ones that I found. And we'll get into sort of how I got into him. But yeah, I've been sort of following you before I even knew you. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we crossed paths. We were both at a conference last September, the Global Lean Summit that Jared Thatcher and Anna Thatcher produced. So I'm glad we were able to cross paths there. It was a great event. I'm going to be back there again this year. Or will you be back, John? Or?
Yeah, I need to talk to Jared. So yeah, I probably, but okay. Yeah, I definitely want to have a conversation about what are some of the things. Yeah.
No pressure, but it would be good to see you there. I've enjoyed talking to you. So let me tell you a little bit more about John. He is focused on DevOps, DevSecOps, IT risk, modern governance, and audit compliance. Over the course of his career, he has sold companies to Docker and to Dell, and he played a foundational role at Opscode, now called Chef. In addition, John founded Gulf Breeze Software, an award-winning IBM business partner that was recognized for its successful deployment of Tivoli technology for enterprise clients. He has authored 6 IBM Redbooks on enterprise systems management and served as the founder and chief architect of Chainbridge Systems. So altogether, he's written more than 11 books and launched over 10 startups, cementing his reputation as a significant innovator in the IT industry. So I think there's a lot to talk about, and if we've got a listener who says, well, I don't work in software or agile or DevOps, keep listening, because I think we're going to have a conversation that has a lot of applicability in those realms and beyond. I think you would agree, John.
I'm glad you said that, because as we get into Deming, that was one of the beauty of what Deming did, right? He literally showed the world that you could do other than just statistical quality parts control, that you could use these methodologies and ideas, which you've embraced and I've embraced. So yes, hang on. At least give me 10 minutes before you
give us a chance. So, John, I'd love to ask people about their origin story when it comes to, lean or continuous improvement or Dr. Deming. And as I was reading about, in your book, it sounded like there was kind of a roundabout, indirect path to Deming. But, if you would, though, I think it would be interesting to hear, kind of decade by decade, starting, when you were at Exxon and what you were learning or doing then.
There's 2 ways to look at my career. One, I'm the dog and the squirrel who's like, squirrel, or I'm like an innovator who catches a wave, at least before the next decade of the wave occurs. So you can pick your poison. But yeah, I started out at Exxon Corporation in literally the 80s, in 1979, 80. And, for those old enough, that was the oil boom. And so I looked into, and it wasn't just oil, probably, it was really geophysical discovery. So one of my claims to fame that actually launched me into the software business was we got the first commercial Cray. It was the 100th Cray ever made.
Supercomputer, right?
For you youngins, these are like world class. They were like GPUs, but they were like as big as a room. Yeah, you want to put it in perspective. So I wrote an accounting system for this system because it was really the first time anybody had used this supercomputer for a commercial endeavor. Now the commercial endeavor was discovering where oil might be, but still it was commercial. And that, so I spent my first 10 years of my career, like literally writing IBM mainframe assembler coding, which couldn't have been a better baptism for coding in general
Yeah.
for my whole career. And then, when I left there, I found that there was some really great, the late 1980s version of Silicon Valley was down in Northern Virginia, outside of DC there, and that was where a lot of the internet was being born, some of the piping, all that stuff. So I went to work for a software company out of there, spent some time there. So that got me into software. I realized there was this really interesting. There's the corporate. I'm glad I got some corporate time, because I tell young kids, like, you might want to start out in the corporate world. And find out if you like it, because like there's a taste to being independent that has its pluses. Anyway, long story short, I got to see how, sort of how a very sort of, this was, when I got there, it was like 50 people. We went through an IPO. I mean, this was like, as learning the industry, I've always felt gifted, not gifted, been given the gift.
Yeah.
Worked through that, made actually a fair amount of money at about 22 years old. And then like an idiot blew it all because I was young, single. And but anyways, worked my way into the what started to happen in the early 90s is what we would first call distributed computing. And again, being heavily involved in this, I created my first software company around all this. How are we going to manage mainframes and desktops and computers? And so we created a company. We were on a really bad curve of like the industry changing. Long story short, we actually sold it, made a little money there, right? So that was okay too. And then I guess that got me into more modern stuff, right? Like let's jump ahead. It's like this. There's a lot of stuff in between, but I think the stuff that got really interesting, which was, I had heard a friend of mine. So I've always been what we would call an infrastructure and operations person.
Okay.
So most of my career is like figuring out how to help a bank run anything from how you deliver the software to the security to even the physical, less that these days, but certainly early in my career, a lot of sort of physical capacity, physical wiring, physical, how do you manage it from a software side? And so I spent, like most of my career in what I would call, INO. And, and as we got into this sort of the early cloud, but more importantly, this sort of DevOps thing that didn't really exist yet, we saw the distribution patterns of, well, you had Agile, right? So you had Lean, right? So Lean is manifesting in a lot of ways. It's got sort of a little bit of gravity in IT.
Yeah.
I forget the book Lean IT was written, and then
Steve Bell and then
he was actually an early co-author of the DevOps Handbook, but he dropped out. Just to want some trivia, but
then Tom and Mary Poppendike.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I love.
They've been on the podcast here,
right? Okay, yeah. I mean, those two are like just glorious treasures, So I every time I get a chance to be with those two, it's just amazing. But yeah, like what she did, and I wrote about her in my Deming book, right? Like how excused not really excused, but there's the profound nature of what that book did, right? This idea that there was all this sort of hospital and like other areas that were doing Lean, and she sort of transferred it to software development, and it literally. It grabbed hold of the whole Agile, the early Agile people. It made sense to everybody, right? Not yet the operations folk, so this thing is sort of growing. I'm sort of, and the real constraint was that we had, there was a lot of developers growing, and there were a lot of infrastructure people, and they just weren't communicating. And so, so a gentleman named Patrick Barr ran an event called DevOps Days. We've had some rumblings of things like this. We had ops management camps, but I was the only American at that event. And it was about 40 or 50 people who went out and started the DevOps in Australia, started in England, started in Europe. And I'm the one that came back and started in the US with my good friend, Damon Edwards. We ran the first DevOps Days in Mountain View, actually at LinkedIn. And what was interesting is Gene Kim and I got on a panel. Now, I knew who Gene Kim was, Like, because I had read, for us ops people, visible ops is sort of our coffee stained, pull it out of your, everybody had a copy if you read
Yeah.
any large infrastructure. But I didn't really know who he was by face, so I'm on a panel with him, and next thing I get off the panel, and my friend Damon comes up, you know who that was? I'm like, panel guy number 3, I don't know. And he's like, no, that was Gene Kim. I'm like, no. And I go looking for him, I can't find him. So what happens is, we agree to meet at South by Southwest. Gene is doing a presentation, and we have coffee, and he tells me about this book he's about halfway done, which is the Phoenix Project.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. And he gave me the greatest gift. This was the on-ramp to my Deming sort of fascination, or sort of unspinning vortex of like this guy getting in your head, Dr. Deming. But he went ahead and the greatest gift I think Gene ever gave me, and Gene has done a lot of things in my career, but for me. But he said, I really want you to read this book about the Elliot Goldratt guy.
Yeah, the goal.
Go. And I'm like, sure. You say, but when Gene tells me to read a book in bold caps, I read it. Like he's the one who told me to read Toyota Kata. He's the one who told me High Velocity Edge. I had no idea who Mike Rother was or Steven Stewart was. Yeah. And he just sent me an email. You must read this book, right? Mm-hmm. So I read that book, and then I read like 3 or 4 Goldrats. I'm like, oh my God, this guy is my soul. This is amazing. And ultimately, as we kept the conversation going, so that started me on this journey, and I'll come back to that, which gets me into sort of last sort of decade or so. Yeah. But at the same time, we start talking about, one of the things that actually happened at that first meeting South by Southwest, Gene was not, and he said this publicly, not convinced the Phoenix Project was really grounded in this new concept of DevOps. Mm-hmm. And so he sat down and asked me, he didn't say it exactly like this, but is this the sham? Those weren't his exact words. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, and he quotes this all the time. I say, Gene, no, for people in operations, it's like we've been lost at sea, and it's the lighthouse to bring us back. And he's often quoted, and then that was the light bulb went off. Sorry, double metaphor. The light went off, and he decided to really focus his telling of his book about this is a DevOps story. And that's where we started talking about we're going to need a prescriptive. The Phoenix Project is a novel. It's just like the goal. Elliot Goldratt had the same problem. You'd read the novel and you'd say, okay, now what do I do? So we knew that was going to come. So we started having the conversations about writing a book, that was more of a prescriptive guide. And we started collecting evidence from the conferences that we ran, and we called it DevOps Handbook. But meanwhile, sort of the other fork on that scenario is I started running the first couple of DevOps days in the US, right? Me and Damon Edwards and another gentleman at I think it was the second one, we ran a Goldratt theory of constraints open space discussion. Mm-hmm. And it's a really good friend of mine who, probably reads 5 or 6 operational research, but he's an IT person, Ben Rockwood, but he literally reads at least one operational research book or paper a week, right? He's just one of those guys. Yeah. And so he really didn't do this, but sort of in a way, oh, John, it all goes back to this guy called Dr. Deming.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, man, Goldratt is the guy. Why are you doing this to me? I just spent a year and a half, on this. And he's like, just go read something about Deming's 14 points. Mm-hmm. This is the point where if you are not a Deming fan, leave. This is where you start this thing you can't get out of because you become so fascinated. And I know you've been through this. Mm-hmm. And so I did. And I spent, basically a good solid year just trying to figure out who this guy was. Yeah. And we were finishing DevOps Handbook, and I started this presentation called Deming to DevOps, where I really was like, oh my God, this non-deterministic mathematical physicist literally was explaining for 70, 80 years the things that we put in PowerPoint slides or Google Slides decks in our Deming presentations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that just started this incredible journey to the point where I, once we finished the handbook a little while later, I wanted to do, so there's the goal and there's beyond the goal. So if you read the goal and you haven't read listen to the audio only beyond the goal.
Yeah.
And I went to Gene, it was a couple years in, and I said, we probably should prepare for something like a Beyond the Phoenix project in the sort of somewhat, modeled after the idea that you might have a better story to tell about a book. And we plan to do it audio only. And what we wound up doing is he explained how he wrote the book, The Phoenix Project, explained how he researched GoRat. And I, at that point, was so deep into Deming that I literally laid out, an audio section on Deming, and then we put it all together in Lean, how to inflect Lean, how to affect Agile, how to sort of really be the plumbing of DevOps. And at that point, after we published the audio-only book, Deming to DevOps, Beyond the Phoenix Project. I get my books right.
Yeah.
Gene said to me, "You need to write a book about this guy." And so for the next 8 or 9 years, I just collected stories and different things that I read. And at some point, I realized there was an architecture or an arc, not an architecture, an arc to this book to tell a story. I'm a big Michael Lewis fan.
Yeah. Moneyball
the Flash Boys. You just go on and on. And I love what he does is he tells a story that's very technical, that the technical people accept and understand and like, and the people who are novices, like Flash Boys, tells me about insider trading, high frequency trading, dark box trading, and I like reading that book. It all made sense to me. So I figured I looked at all the books. I started reading all the books I could about Deming, and I noticed that like all of them had a pattern of like anywhere from 5 to maybe 15 pages of biography. Again, give or take the book, but then almost exclusively the rest of the book is his management theories and his ideas and why they're important, and that's important. But nobody had written a storytelling book, or how would Michael Lewis write a book? And I'm not saying I'm as good a writer as Michael Lewis, whether you like him or hate him, but the real meta point was that nobody was writing a book in a Michael Lewis style about this guy who had just screamed to be a Michael Lewis character.
Right.
Billy Bean and Moneyball, and the RBC trader from so. And then the stories just started coming in like flashes of divine lights, like Doris Quinn, who I could talk about. Like nobody, even the hardcore Deming people, don't know this woman traveled with him his last year of his life. That some of the things he did in between Hawthorne and what has been the greatest thing about it is 2 things. One is I have 2 target readers when I write a book. One is my mother-in-law. Reads a ridiculous amount of books, but is not technical in any way, and a particular subject matter expert. In this case, it was Ben Rockwood. And if I've succeeded, they both enjoy the book.
Yeah.
And but the thing that I think has been most rewarding is the old time Deming folks. The sort of Bill Bellows and his crowd, where they tell me, I liked the book a lot. And by the way, there were 3 or 4 things I didn't even know. And I hung out with Dr. Deming, so that was to me the greatest thing. And then, I've always been an advisor of infrastructure. My day job is always working for, coming into banks, doing some what I call qualitative analysis across the whole IT spectrum. It's been, fairly sophisticated models of how your organization is behaving, looking for those IT security, IT risks, infrastructure, the classic lean, looking for waste, looking for opportunities for flow, all those things. So I think it's a pretty good swath of like about 4 decades of stuff.
Right. Well, as you write about it, I'd love to hear you share a little bit more about, you talk about how this journey of being at Exxon in the 80s, you realized later there were things happening there influenced by Deming. And then it sounds like you took a turn back into corporate. You were at GE in the 90s during Six Sigma era. And then it sounds like you connected the dots later on. So
I'm glad you brought that up.
How that influence was there, even though you didn't.
That was funny because I'm in the at Exxon in the 80s, and there were a lot of sort of data crunchers there, right? Again, you can imagine not just like geophysical data, but like a lot of data science. What we now call data scientists, back then they were just nerds, if you will. but they. Once I sort of was able to look back in time, there were people that, even from some of their research and stuff, were using control charts and stuff like that. So I was sort of seeing control charts, in the infrastructure stuff, but not really, didn't study it, but okay, yeah, I need to know that. Thank you for this. And sort of started, I really understood actually, the complexity, as I think about even now, the complexity of what a control chart tells you about the upper and lower control limits, common cause, again, I'm sure people heard enough of that on your podcast, but then you're right. Then I go independent. I do all these. There's a couple of software companies, and then I take a job at. My wife happens to work in a GE Capital, and then I get immersed in Six Sigma. Fighting, kicking, and biting. But actually, in a lot of ways, I have these arguments with people who hate Jack Welch, and I can do all that too. But I went to Crotonville. I was able to go to Crotonville and sit in, and I will tell you, if I took the top 10 courses I've taken in terms of like how to create models, how to code, how to do infrastructure management, theory of management, I would say in the top 5 was manager modeling, which is a class they taught at Crotonville. And I wish I could find it in my garage somewhere. It was one of the best. It was a top 5 class that I've ever taken. And, and the things we were learning about diversity, I mean, there was and I'm not talking about just DEI. I mean, like the thing about, my chain of managers were a woman all the way up, and I was pretty high up even at that point. Right. I don't know. There was so many things and the Six Sigma stuff was sort of annoying, right? Because it was so dogmatic in the way people would implement it, like where you'd be like, you'd literally hide out to know if one of the leaders is coming down the hall because they're going to drag your ear over to the large chart and they're going to have to explain where you are in the Deming, right? It was when you get to that level where people are afraid to like go to lunch at lunchtime because somebody might ask exactly where are you right now in that chart here. I mean, I've seen that. Like, all right, but like I want to make this podcast an anti Six Sigma. But what was interesting, yeah, I mean, I think most of us know Deming sort of would deny that he had anything to do with Six Sigma, but it was the roots of a lot of things that might. You probably have more.
Well, there was roots, but just to interject on one thing, in one of the Jack Welch books, it might have been Straight from the Gut or one of those books, he actually mentions Deming, and unfortunately, Jack Welch. Took a bit of a swipe at Deming and said something to the effect of like, "Oh, the ideas were too theoretical," which I think
that's what Duran said too, right?
But I think it's so practical. I think Jack Welch missed the point.
Well, a lot of people do. I mean, like again, that whole sort of. We don't have to go off on this, but like just since we're on it, and I love to just have fun and podcast. That's the big argument that like Duran. There's this argument who created the miracle in Japan. I was pretty clear in my book that the Japanese created the miracle. And I'm really not. Yeah, I mean, I dig Dr. Deming, but I try to calibrate, how great he is. But then there's these arguments like Duran, Deming gets way too much credit. Duran, all his ideas failed because it was too I mean, really, I just peel the onion on Dr. Deming, and you've been incredibly successful. Implementing, his ideas. I believe, I think I can say that based on what I know about your career and, the stuff
where it's been welcome,
But you gotta. This is the other thing. I mean, if there's a lesson learned, you got to do some work yourself. I mean, too many people want the magic bullet. They get into the Deming stuff and this is hard. Yeah, no kidding.
Same with Lean. Same with Agile.
Yeah, and when Deming used to yell at people and say, "Hey, do you want me to teach you and do your job?"
Yeah. But you mentioned that one instance of fear, fear of being grilled or fear of being put on the spot. Like when I think of Dr. Deming's 14 points, the idea of eliminate fear, driving out fear from workplaces. How have you seen that concept operationalized, if you will, in IT and entrepreneurship settings?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to that, when I was challenged to go look at Deming's 14 points, and I studied these points, and it's like water in the desert. I told you about the sort of fear of people trying to walk the hall at GE Capital because, they didn't want to run into one of their black belts or the executive team, because literally that's what they do. I have another great story. One of my I don't talk about so much, but if you've heard of the operating system Ubuntu, it was created by a guy named Mark Shuttleworth, a guy named Simon Wardley, who you should know about because his Wardley mapping is an amazing tool. So I'll just put that as a placeholder for you.
No, I don't know.
It's a lot of people in Lean Community and Agile have really adopted this. But anyway, he worked for a company called Canonical, where we worked for Mark Shuttleworth, which is the company that built Ubuntu. And that guy, so this is a guy that when he's like in his 20s, he sells his first company for $500 million just so the competing company could shut down his technology because he's too competitive. Yeah. Then gets to invest it, doubles his money, and as a hobby decides to write a competing operating system that competes mostly with Windows, but it was a Unix based. Right. But the guy was like a crazy rich CEO, right? And so one of the things when you went to their headquarters in London, you'd watch this pattern because he was like the guy that would put his fingers on everything. And so the fear would be, these people would be like, they had his schedule down, almost like you could have done a control chart to make sure you didn't see him. Because if you saw him, you're like, what are you working on? And then like, well, we're putting out this release tomorrow. It's pretty much ready to go. Let me see it. And I'm not kidding. He'd literally walk you back to your office and he'd be like, I want that to be green. That should be yellow. The thing is like cut off everything. And again, what people don't realize, okay, there's a lot of CEOs or twiddlers that want to have the hands in everything. And we can talk about the meddling of that. But what really creates a disruption in an organization is when those second order effects, where you're disrupting the sort of the Deming says the joy in work, the schedule, the way people are building. They talk about the classic, they build a park and then there's a sidewalk and then all of a sudden becomes a path that becomes what you're doing is you're sort of creating that disruptive flow in your organization. And if I thought about it harder, I could think over and over of situations where things are absolutely wrong. There's no way this software can go out. I can't tell you how many releases big name software releases that somehow I was involved as a consultant or not, that had disastrous results where everybody in the room, except the person who was responsible for the delivery date, basically disagreed that product should go out the door that next day. And nobody would say a word, right? And so I get to Deming's 14 points and all those things. I was like, this is my life. Yeah, this guy's describing in a way that I just haven't really been able to put in a template. Yeah. So yes, fear is probably one. If joy is the best part of his advice, fear is the sort of worst part of.
Well, being see where fear saps the joy out of work. And in the book you mentioned, it's a phrase that wasn't used in Dr. Deming's time, but you use the phrase psychological safety.
That's right.
And you cite Amy Edmondson. What do you have stories or examples that kind of just back to this idea of people being afraid to speak up? And what can be done to counter that? I guess Deming would say substitute leadership. I
think that, one of the things we learned, so a big thing in infrastructure and operations, I apologize, people know this already, but incident management is a critical place where you can literally start using a lot of the advice from a lot of the management leaders, Lean, Agile,
what kind of incidents?
The impact of it. So incidents are usually something goes wrong. Yeah. Right. Something goes wrong, and the manifestation of that is maybe customers can't order books, or you can't do an ATM. Again, everybody knows that end of it, right? But so in incident management, what you find is there's a lot of great Deming principles in terms of fear is. And I'll get to how I have an industry, and I wrote about some of this, but the whole last third of my book is what would Deming done if he lived in the sort of cyber crises and all this stuff, right? But But what would happen is, you would literally, there would be, sort of this ridiculously deterministic root cause. Bill did it, because Bill's not here today, right?
Overly simplistic and blaming.
Yeah, and or it was even like if you've read any Eric Ries's his Lean Startup book, right? He shows the example of the Joe brought down the system, and they use the 5 whys. And we talked about the 5 whys. 5 whys, if you interpret it as 5 questions and you're done, you don't understand it. If you actually as enough places to get to a reasonable probability of what might have never root cause happened. But he does a great example of, okay, and you can use these on airline crashes too, but he does this thing like Joe brought down the system. Okay, why did Joe bring down the system? Well, Joe was a new employee. Okay, why being a new employee might have, because you were down at the third question. So, well, because he got in at a date where we wind up skipping individual coding intro employee training every other month to save money. So he met this weird, and by the way, the Air Alaska is almost an identical in terms of fixing an engine, where one plane got caught in the middle of a change schedule of maintenance that statistically said you could skip a month, but it wound up going like 4 months or 3 months. Anyway, and he goes to what would the training have done? Well, why would the training? Well, because they had guardrails, these libraries that were guardrails that he probably didn't know about, that he might have implemented, and then therefore the sort of luxury that everybody else had, he didn't have for a common mistake that every coder on the planet. Nobody writes perfect code, and so the point was, we were starting to realize a lot of and actually bringing in a lot of cognitive AI, airline safety, all this, so guys like Dr. Woods, Sidney Decker, and those guys started showing up in our conversation. We first called them blameless postmortems.
Mm-hmm.
And then a friend of mine used to teach a class on how to do blameless postmortem. And like you play games, like you'd say, okay, describe the incident. Well, Bill, it was a sort of fun whack-a-mole game where you and how hard it would be to watch. I've been in some of these where they watch people like, yeah, you're right, I can't say his name. Can I say he? No, you can't say he. And that has matured into a level we call it learning from incidents, or the LFI Institute, right? Mm-hmm. So and what that uncovers is a lot of so now let's go to the core of what I wanted to write about in the book, which is the system of profound knowledge. Right. And so if you sort of analyze, so the system of profound knowledge, most people might know who read this, right? And it's mostly described in his New Economics book, but it's basically SOPK. And there are what Deming said in sort of my interpretation, using the words that I would use now versus what he used. I would say there are 4 elements to understand complexity. And everything we do is these complex domains, right? And involve complex systems. And so one of them is, and I think of them, people have yelled at me. I think there's an order here, but and I almost got physically beat up over LinkedIn calling but yeah. So I think there's an order, right? And so the order I think is the theory of knowledge, and that's epistemology. And I write about pragmatism. I write about C.I. Lewis. I write about the influence from Stewart. So if that's interesting, how epistemology and how we think, which actually plays even a deeper role in AI now, if we get to that at the end. Yeah. And then you have sort of what I would put then the second element, which would be variation, right? And all this. Then I would say is the question that I asked in the book is, if you put it in this order, and I know they say it should be no order, it should be all the 4 things, but I think the first question is, do we question what we think we know? And we don't do that enough. Like we take bias, or we've done that before, the Grace Hopper quote, right? And we don't, where the first question, we should constantly in a loop. So what we think, do we actually know what we think we know?
Right. And how do we know it?
Well, that's right. And how do we? And then sort of you can then stretch that to at least getting some data, analytical statistics, and other to at least give you some sense of discovery. Oh, well, this is weird. One of the things I love about control charts, again, I haven't done them in anger like some you've done and other people have done, but the thing I love about control charts is and this is another sort of really hacked up Deming quote, but like you said, that like the job of the statistician is not to solve the problem; it's to get the subject matter expert to look for the problem. So that's that sort of. Now, let me question whether I know it or no. Let me control chart it, and like, what is this number? Where is this thing here? And then you go by the rules. And then the third, right, is like, okay, we get all that right, but we have to have the psychology part.
Yeah.
We got to understand intuition. We need to understand bias. We understand intrinsic or extrinsic motive, all those complexities, right?
Right.
And I stopped saying this, but I almost like to say, but people get angry when I say this. The same reason that they do when I put it in order is I say that really the appreciation of systems should be the fourth discipline.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the third discipline. Yeah, right. In this sort of triumph of the fourth. I'm like, my mind. Don't get old, folks. The fourth discipline, and people are, you can't, like you don't understand. Like, I know I do understand, but it is system thinking.
Yeah.
Like if somebody said to me, you talk about psychological safety, right? Google did that incredible research, and like really the answer to like insane amount of research was 2 words: psychological safety.
Yeah.
Right?
Why are some teams more successful?
Right.
Psychological safety. Yes.
And I would say if I only had 2 words to express how to improve all technology and even all business, and I was only given 2 words, be systems thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, so like that thing, when you look at it from taking this all the way back to like the sort of the idea of what have I learned and how did this apply incident management, in IT, like I think Joe went down the system, or I think it was that library, or I think it was, that electrical outage we had there. Well, how do you know that?
Right.
And do you really know that?
Do you know this, or is it a guess or a hypothesis?
And for years, our industry in IT and stuff, we've been terrible at, blame or like root cause. It had to be billed, write it down a bill, or napkin based. It started at 8. It ended at 8:36, I think, because I wrote those numbers down. And then, by the way, a system that runs, like an order of magnitude larger than trillions in an hour of transactions or instructions literally can't be described by one sentence of why the outage happened. Like the complexity of modern systems, like from networks to storage to the complexity of compute, and to say that. So what we've learned is when we do blameless postmortems, we stay religiously away from trying to find a root cause. We religiously stay away from trying to blame anybody, and we honor that these are complex systems and there might be multiple answers and there might be no answer to the question. And then we think about how we prove. And that allows us to, so we do some statistical analysis. We, the psychological safety, guys like John Osbar, and we can point to him. He worked at Etsy, and they would have like a new employee come in and these postmortem and say, hey guys, we don't have to review this. I know what I did it and we don't need to look at it. And they would, no, we're going to look at it. Yeah, but I know what it finds out the person didn't really know what it was.
Yeah.
And then you sort of wrap that in that, like, I love Bill Bellow's discussion. He's probably one of my favorite people when he tries to explain Taguchi and these things about how you look at systems and really ultimately, he's a big ACOF. He got to hang out with ACOF, and so like just mirror everything Bellow says about system thinking, and I'm all in. And Lily, it's the fourth. And so again, all of that. Did your outage cause latency? You were a database, incident. Like, how did it affect, ordering, wasabi on some, like that might have been not the direct correlation with system thinking, right? Again, so all of that. So yes, so I think, and like I can go into all the other aspects of IT and IT infrastructure, where all those ideas. And they're the same fundamental ideas. Think, do scientific method. I think Mike Rother did a great book in Toyota Kata.
Right.
variation. Don Wheeler, you talked about Don Wheeler. I wish I'd read more of him. He just seems like, and then, on the psychological safety. Yeah, I mean, then you get into Senge, you can get into the Kahneman, right? I mean, a lot of the sort of bias stuff from, Kahneman, thinking fast and slow. And then, and then system thinking, we can go crazy there. But yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think back to the original thing, that these concepts, the reason what Deming realized is he took what were basically wrote history of quality control issues that should kind of put in a perspective that really solved manufacturing of telephones really well, and manifested a lot in Bell Labs, but mostly it was manufacturing. What Deming did, in a general way, is he took those ideas and he created templates for any possible industry, but him, using it in labor and statistics, using it, in different places. And I think these, the reason, so, what's kind of funny, you should probably never invite me back on podcasts because I don't shut up, but I remember when I first heard the idea of this title of System Profound Knowledge, I thought, yeah, okay. I read his 14 points. He's pretty smart. It doesn't annoy me. But I remember explaining it once to a really good friend of mine who didn't know anything about Deming, and he said, that's pretty arrogant.
Right? Call yourself or your work profound.
Yeah, you call your own work profound. But then, one of the things I talked about in the book, there was a conversation he had, and you had to understand Deming speak, and I know you do. Like when Deming said something, you really have to sort of step back and think about it. So he did an interview, and he said, it's misinterpreted by many people, said there was only one person in Japan, and we're talking about when he was in Japan, that understood profound knowledge. And so you could listen to that and say, oh, what a jerk.
Yeah.
He was the smartest guy in Japan in 1950. What about Iran? What about, but if you understood Deming, I'm certain what he meant was there's this thing, a cloud of knowledge that's out there for the picking. And and I was the only one that was putting systems in his Mount Hawkon speech, right? That was a systems thinking speech. Mount Hawkoni, right? Like, and going back to my book, I wanted to write a book that was Michael Lewisian, that literally could tell the story of where did System of Profound Knowledge come from. Yeah. And he didn't just pull it out of his head.
Right. Yeah. And there's where it came from, and then there's applications. So, I'd like to talk about, there were some things, toward the end of the book. One of the stories you described, I hadn't heard it described this way, a digital Cambrian explosion in technology. If you could tell us a little bit about that and what you think Dr. Deming's role was in that.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that was actually what we called Gene Kim's original site. It was used to say that the digital Cambrian explosion. After about 5 years, they took it off. But that was originally like the subtitle of the whole IT revolution group. And what it was, it was really not. Again, this was my I didn't really understand Deming, but it was, I'll try to keep it as short as possible. Google was the first software business, and actually really any company that wasn't government related that had a chief economist. Right, like this is
as a position in the company.
As a position in the company, this is 2007, 2008, right? And I thought, wow, that's pretty free, because the banks didn't have that position, or a farmer, unless you were sort of very regulated by government things, you might have had it. But anyway, he wrote this article and he talked about the Cambrian explosion. And what we had is this sort of like cloud and compute, and all these things were coming together as an inflection. And I just sort of thought about that a lot. And at that time I was, again, my dog squirrel thing, I got deeply into the NoSQL movement. I did presentations. I helped consult organizations on how to get into these. This is sort of pre-AI. Like how do you build large clusters of like knowledge in a format that's unstructured, unlike SQL or Oracle. And so I spent a lot of time working and presenting there. And I thought I really tried to expand his version of what this meant. And it meant like compute, the way we think about data, the way we're getting educated with things like Lean and Agile that are influencing like Mary Poppendieck and influence how we do IT, and like IT is going to explode, and the cloud's just coming out. I'm working for what's called infrastructure as code. One of my startups was, how to build infrastructure like 10x faster, right? Than just, manually doing stuff. And we expanded on that. But what's interesting though is the last third of my book is like, so Deming dies in 1993.
Right.
And then the last third of my book is like all the things that happened that I've been involved in since after 1993. And so a lot of those things, the cloud doesn't start in anger till like maybe late 90s. Mm-hmm. Or, and then depending on what version of cloud in the late 2000s, right? I mean, 2010, 2009, so, and even things like if you go back to Agile Manifesto and stuff like that, I don't know, but they're post Deming, or they're like, he's not going to be going to Vail or not Vail or wherever they had the original Agile Manifesto meeting, or like, so he missed this whole thing. Mm-hmm. He missed an incredible amount of technology that like started around 1990. That if you looked at 1993, I mean, in fact, just as I was just doing a presentation last night, in 1998 is when basically all recorded benchmarks started for AI, right? Like, so those things that like now are just like happening at it like hour by hour, a minute. So anyway. So in a lot of ways, I didn't know about him through that part, didn't understand him until like, probably 2009, 2010, whatever. So he didn't really influence. But if I look back, and that's what I tried to do in the book, like what would have Deming done? How would this have related to SOPK? To my friend Josh Corman, who helped the FDA pull the first medical device off the market without having proof of death. Single-handedly saved millions, maybe billions of lives. But before that, if you put a medical device, it was an infusion pump that they proved to the FDA and the government. It took them 2 years to prove this, to white hat hacking, that you could kill somebody because this one particular device had a three-letter hard-coded password that you couldn't change, right?
Yeah.
And literally you could walk in there and you could double the dosage of what it was, just electronically. So
better to be proactive about that risk than to wait for how many deaths to prove.
Well, there's the point. Yeah. The FDA already had a precedence that you had to have proof of death. And like they were able to get them to change something else. Because if you're a vendor and you had that, hey, I've been approved, man. Like, and I know it's not easy legally, but like you had some like, hey, it was been approved, it's been tested by the FDA. But now, and there's been no, like at the time, no proof of death. But like, they changed everything. But like, there's stories and stories about, a woman named Shannon Leitz that literally ran, she runs what they call red teams at banks, like 50, 80 people that their full-time job from the time they get in the morning to the time they leave is just to externally attack their own company, right? This is unprecedented for most banks. But like all the things that I tell her, like, you're a Deming and you don't even follow Deming, Yeah. And so I spent a lot of time analyzing all those things that happened mid to late 90s and the early 2000s. And that, that's, the second half of my career, basically, which has been just incredibly fascinating. And like and saying, okay, I know enough about Deming to put a reasonable lens on what would he do. How would he think about this? How would you think about this, given the principles of the elements of system of profound knowledge?
Yeah. One of the things you write about is the threat of cyber terrorism and why. I mean, this is stepping back a little bit from Lean. This is just my curiosity taking it this direction. I mean, why do you say that's one of the biggest threats to the world today?
Oh, it's actually sort of probably worse than we know, but. I mean, this could go on. Keep it in Deming perspective. I talked about how cyber terrorists before one of the Super Bowls in Tampa literally were able to get in through a simple remote routing cursor mouse thing, which basically a virtual control system into their control system for a water treatment plant. and one of the operators was just sitting back because everything's sort of on autopilot most of the time, saw the mouse running around, ignored it. Kept his eye on the thing, sort of like maybe a little bit later, it was not just moving around, it was moving levers. It was literally trying to poison the water. This was within the week of the Super Bowl. That was the jurisdiction of the water you would have got at the stadium, right? And then I try to cover a fair amount of those stories. I mean, at the end of the day, so Jen Easley just left CISA, which is part of Homeland Security, right? And she wrote a parting letter. And I don't want to be political or anything. It doesn't matter. She said, let's call it as we see it. And she basically wrote, you should look at it. Jen Easley, she was head of CISA, which is the cyber infrastructure security under Homeland Security. It was established, I don't know, not too long ago, but they do incredible work on research of all things cyber, but certainly cyber infrastructure. And if you read her article, and my good friend Josh Corman, who this is his subject matter, he's an expert, he's a white hat hacker. There are people, and I'm sort of like listening, that believe that China will basically disrupt, or anybody really can disrupt, the water supply. In a major city that could, and the infrastructure is so outdated that it might take 2 or 3 weeks to fix. And a major city can't go with 2 or 3 weeks away. Right. And this is things that, if you read some of the CISA reports, they're screaming out loud.
Yeah.
Whether you hate China, love China, I mean, there's something called sort of the Vault Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. Read them. Just read about what's going on. And these are intelligent, top of their game cyber investigators who are screaming out loud about what China is doing to our telecom, to what they're doing to our water supply, to what they're doing to our power supply, or the things that they, that we're seeing. I just touch on the beginnings of that, but I think right now, if you just follow over the last year, just Google, cyber infrastructure, cyber critical infrastructure. I mean, I lose an hour of sleep a night on this subject. So
yeah. I see the articles. I just did a quick search about her stepping down. If you could send me a link to that piece, that letter, I'll put a link to that notes. But I mean, this sounds like it seems like how to say this. There's some human nature where we are not good at being proactive when it comes to big systemic risks. We'll wait and react. I mean, even this collision, I was reading a big New York Times piece the other day, the collision between the Army helicopter and the American Airlines regional jet. As we're recording this on February 13th, it's not known exactly what happened. We would probably agree there's no single root cause of what Bill or Barb did wrong. But, this article was talking about the known risks, the people that were screaming that this is quite literally an accident waiting to happen. And, it just seems like, we wait and we react.
No, and we talked about this in the other podcast, so I encourage you to go listen to that one, because we talk a lot more about your books and your stuff. But Diane Vaughn, who wrote a book about the Challenger disaster, and she coined the term normalization of deviance.
Right.
And so this becomes this thing. We just accept these things. Like, first it should be, you even talked about the Swiss cheese model. Well, the Swiss cheese model in one version is there is all these things are getting blocked by the big block of cheese that has these different holes in different spaces. But every once in a while, it pierces through just a cylinder of holes.
Things line up,
and they line up, and so the thing about the scary thing is getting that, understanding that you could literally there's disasters that are waiting, and they get compounded when we don't. Again, I point to my friend John Allsbar. He says that, back to incidents. One of my favorite quotes to him, and a gentleman named Dr. Cook, which is, incidents are unplanned investments. So in other words, these are knowledge. So most people, I write about in my book, a lot of organizations, like classify napkin-based, not statistical process control of what a category is of an incident.
Yeah.
Is that a P1 or P2? It's rainy and it's Monday. Let's make it a P2, right? Mm-hmm. And then their capacity and then they have a categorization system of like P1 through P4 in some cases, right? And their allocated capacity to what they think they need to be doing at any given time is usually enough to cover a good portion of the P1s, every other week a small portion of the P2s.
Yeah.
And what John Oswald would say, well, there's two ways to look at it. Is what John Oswald would say is those P2, P3s, and P4s are incredible amount of knowledge. If we aggregated it, if we did something simple like put statistical process control on it, we might see unbelievable data of that potential, what the P Taoist, the black swan guy.
Yeah.
We call a black swan, right? And like we call black swans, but they're just sitting there. And this is why I love your book about accidents. Like they're just sitting there. And that the other thing is, Decker would say that I love my quote. Sidney Decker was a prolific writer about airline safety and hospital safety. He said that Murphy's law is wrong. He said that people think Murphy's law is everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Mm-hmm. Dr. Decker says everything that can go wrong will go right. That's the disaster. Yeah. The fact that you're not getting to see all those almost what some people call near misses. Anyway, I think that ties it all back to the again how this all fits to profound knowledge, being able to scientifically decipher what you know, and running through the sort of middle of the psychology, the biases, and the systems.
Yeah. Well, our guest again today has been John Willis. We've had two great conversations that we've recorded. Your wealth of knowledge, and it's really interesting to hear your story and what you've been learning and applying, John. So just to recap, John's most recent book, I recommend it. It's Deming's Journey to Profound Knowledge. And then the podcast, you can check that out. Profound. That's not John calling himself profound, but that's
that's right. I'm pulling the Deming card out. Like there was only one person in DevOps who understood profound knowledge. And just a little quick. I know we're sort of running on the edge, but I've just spent the last year and a half writing another book about the history of AI. It's called Rebels of Reason. It actually is very much like how would Michael Lewis write a book about the history of AI? And then just like I found in the Deming, the humans and the stories are just, so it is really, there's an epistemological view of why this is important. You should understand the history of, there's a famous AI quote by the guy who coined AI. He said that, once you know how it works, we don't call it AI, right? So like this history helps you understand what's hype, like hopefully 2 Mondays ago where the markets crashed because some nonsense paper that wasn't even, if you weren't following the whole China deep sea thing. So that's my book, and it has beautiful stories and has beautiful stories of people, and you'll get a sense of like why we're here right now with this thing and actually where it's going. So I'm really excited. I should have the first distributable copies in like April, May.
Oh, so. Okay. Well, I'll look forward to that. There's a lot to learn.
I'm sure Rebels of Reason, meaning that all these people that helped us get to this ChatGPT moment were these interesting rebels that just didn't give up, had faith. Mm-hmm. They were never told no. They didn't fall prey to dogma, and they were like Don Quixote, and now God nuts, but in their sort of quest to solve a problem that they knew had to be solved, but they didn't know what it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, thanks again for being here today. Thank you again for having me on your podcast, and I'll look forward to talking to you more and crossing paths.
Yeah, you'll see at some of the conferences, and it was good. It was great. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure.